In this presentation, my research assistants and I will be sharing with you what we're discovering about the history of the Grand Rapids Public Schools through community engaged research or public history. Next. This presentation highlights select elements of the GRPS Uncovered project, which began as an oral history podcast in 2023 and has grown to include initiatives like the Community Historians Workshop series. The project's long-term aim is a book on the last 50 years of GRPS history. Next. Right now, the heart of the project is doing public history in and with the community. Next. Our research questions are, after the controversial closure of South High in 1968, how did GRPS change or not change? What were the effects of GRPS's integration efforts? Why is the district still segregated today? Next. While we've just begun to scratch the surface, we're sharing our tentative thinking around these questions today, and these are the sources that inform our thinking. Next. Each of the research assistants on this project, students from GVSU, will discuss what they're seeing given their research focus. Melanie conducted research in the Grand Rapids Press, as well as materials in the City Archives and Grand Rapids Public Museum. Joelle conducted oral history interviews, and Avery was assigned to specifically investigate the history of Hall, now Cesar Chavez Elementary School, and the Latino experience in GRPS more broadly. I'll begin our presentation now by setting the historical context of the late 1960s. Next. In the 1950s, compared to cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York, Grand Rapids was still relatively integrated, with a few racially mixed neighborhoods. By 1960, those neighborhoods had disappeared. Between 1950 and 1960, about 8,000 new Black residents moved to Grand Rapids. White residents responded through discriminatory real estate practices or by leaving the city, accelerating suburban growth. These housing shifts quickly reshaped the racial makeup of GRPS. By 1965, anticipating legal challenges, the GRPS School Board created a committee to study racial imbalance. In its final report, which you see here on the slide, the board explained that the committee responded both to the pressure from the NAACP and the Urban League and to its own interest in complying with recent court decisions. Next. They were referring to Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared de jure segregation unconstitutional. While the ruling directly applied to the South, northern districts were becoming increasingly segregated through housing, raising new legal questions about de facto segregation. Next. The committee concluded that de facto segregation existed in GRPS and recommended open housing, inter-school exchanges, cross-cultural projects, and a lab school focused on democratic pluralism. Notably, they did not recommend busing. This raises an important question. If busing wasn't recommended, why did GRPS later close South High and bus students to Union, especially when South was already integrated? Next. Historian Todd Robinson points to two key events. In 1966, about 400 Black students walked out of South High to protest a grooming policy that disproportionately targeted Black boys. Then in the summer of 1967, one day after the unrest in Detroit, Grand Rapids experienced its own uprising. It was after these events that in the spring of 1968, the board responded with a busing plan. One workshop participant told us that no one was smiling in this graduation photo because they had just learned that day that their beloved South High was closing. Next. Busing began that September. Jerry Bentley's podcast, captures the moment the bus pulls into Union.
And so when we pulled up into the teachers' parking lot with the bus, and there are a bunch of buses, in big black letters across the brand new brick on that school, it said, "N-word, go home. N-word, go home." I'm like, what? So we walked in the building, and there was a group of white guys standing watching us come in, and it just ticked me off really bad. So I'm like, what are you looking at? And they didn't say anything, which is good. And we just kept on walking. But that day, probably in the afternoon, was the first race fight.
Just days later, Union closed due to racial violence. By early 1969, the principal resigned. An anti-busing bloc gained control of the school board, and Paul Phillips, the only black board member, stepped down, citing the failure of integration. In the early 1970s, the lawsuit Higgins v. Board of Education challenged GRPS for maintaining segregation. Though unsuccessful, it foreshadowed the Supreme Court's 1974 decision in Milliken v. Bradley, which ruled that de facto segregation was not the same as de jure segregation, effectively ending large-scale busing efforts. So what happened in GRPS after this? I'll now turn to Melanie, who will guide us through the late 1970s and 1980s using newspapers and archival sources.
Thank you, Dr. King. In my research, I examined mostly newspaper coverage in the Grand Rapids Press from the 1970s through the 1980s, focusing on how Grand Rapids public schools were publicly discussed in relation to its fundings, leadership decisions, and desegregation efforts. Across these newspaper articles, several recurring themes emerged. First, the newspapers show the beginning of ongoing financial instability in GRPS, including failed mileages, state cuts in the district's budget, and denied federal aid. For example, in one of the newspaper clippings found titled "Three Groups to Fight 12 Mil" plea from the 1970s shows the district arguing that a 12 mil increase was necessary simply to maintain basic operations within its schools, such as paying their teachers, building maintenance, and transportation. Nearly a decade later, schools denied $500,000 in Aid Act funds from 1979 shows GRPS losing $500,000 in federal funding that was specifically intended to support desegregation efforts. Although the district applied for the Emergency School Aid Act funding, which would pay for things such as programs meant to support integration, only 3 Michigan districts were funded, those districts being Detroit, Ypsilanti, and Ecorse, with GRPS ranking just outside of that cutoff, receiving no federal support. Then, in 1980, with the Schools Ask Mileage Hike article, it shows the district asking voters yet again for additional funding support, this time requesting a 1 mil increase to keep up with rising costs. The second major theme in the newspapers is public debate about busing and integration. Articles like "Busing, A Look of Our Own Bugbear" and "Phony Integration," both from the 70s, show skepticism and resistance towards integration efforts in the Grand Rapids community. Busing in these articles were framed as disruptive or unnecessary, and in "Educators Like Busing But Not for Integration," an article from 71, a local administrator explicitly states that busing is acceptable only for transportation convenience, not as a tool for racial integration. Another pattern that emerges from the newspaper coverage is persistent concern over students' basic needs, particularly food insecurity. In First Poor Kids Need Food, an article from the 70s, GRPS openly acknowledged that many children were coming to their schools hungry and that the district lacked sufficient resources to address these needs without asking for more funding. That same year, the newspaper Hot Lunch Crusade documents efforts by the district and the community to expand access to school meals. Unfortunately, even with these efforts, these needs did not disappear over time. A decade later, guidelines for lunch program from the 80s show that GRPS was still struggling to meet their students' nutritional needs. These financial pressures also affected teachers during this period. Articles such as GR Teachers May Call Strike Monday, Teacher Strike, and Mid-Year Walkout was irresponsible, all from the 80s, show how funding instability created not only contract uncertainty in teachers, but also many teachers were laid off, and the lack of funding created unstable working conditions. When I put the newspaper findings alongside the community historian workshops that we holded, many of these same themes reappeared. First, workshop participants described how integration produced violence inside schools. One former union teacher and basketball coach recalled, quote, "When a Black school and a white school were put together at Union, everything exploded." Participants also emphasized how funding instability combined with white flight impacted student behaviors. One workshop participant explained, quote, "We were seeing children act out in ways we had never seen before because of the economic decline and white flight." Finally, multiple participants described widespread teacher loss and staffing instability during this period. One former Ottawa student recalled, quote, "Teachers were being pink-slipped. Teachers never knew if they were coming back next year." These accounts reflect what appears in the newspapers, but they also add what the articles do not capture: anger, frustration, and fear within the GRPS community and its students. At the same time, the community historian workshops revealed stories that were largely missing from the newspapers. One theme discovered from the workshops was how school environments were remembered as restrictive, controlling, and some participants calling it prison-like. A workshop participant described school buildings designed by prison architects, recalling, quote, "When people complained the windows were too high for the kids to see out of, and that the school's layout resembled a prison, those same architects said, that is where they are going anyways." A former South High student similarly recalled, quote, "Gerald R. Ford was built like a prison. It felt like a prison walkway." Participants also described extreme disciplinary practices within their schools. One former GRPS student recalled, quote, "They locked us in rooms with the lights off. Prison felt the same as school." Finally, busing was remembered not primarily as transportation, but as a matter of safety and protection. A former union student athlete explained, quote, "You cannot walk that route without getting beaten up," referring to the walking route students were expected to take because of busing. These moments do not appear in the newspaper records, but yet this expands our findings by showing how both students and educators experience schooling during these periods, offering new insights into GRPS's inequality, instability, and discipline in ways the press rarely captured. Now I will be handing it off to Avery.
Thank you, Dr. Kang and Melanie. I was originally hired by Dr. Kang to research Cesar E. Chavez Elementary, formerly Hall Elementary. Dr. Kang had conducted a podcast episode with a former principal. This podcast led us to believe that parent advocacy had taken place at the school and it had influenced the rebuild tremendously. As the project progressed, we broadened our focus to explore the history of Latino students and teachers within GRPS. Once we expanded the scope, it became clear that there is very little documented information about the Latino experience in the district. Next. Throughout this research, I have noticed two themes regarding the Latino community in Grand Rapids Public Schools. Number one, their voices have been dismissed, and number two, their experiences have been invisibilized. Next. In the study The Quality of Life for Hispanics in Michigan in 1992, conducted by the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, we gain a clearer understanding of what life was like for the Latino individuals in the Grand Rapids area. The quote provided is taken directly from the study. Juan Salazar, Grand Rapids said, "You have inadequate health care, inadequate housing, excessive unemployment, and you're asking these children from elementary school up through junior and senior high school and then secondary education and master's degrees or law school. You're expecting these kids to deal with all those influences around them, the poverty, the crime rates, the hunger, and all these things, and come out as happy, satisfied human beings." I have found this information to be very beneficial because it highlights what life is like for the Latino community in the Grand Rapids area. With this information, I can clearly see that this group is marginalized and that this marginalization extends into the education system, as I learned through reading studies and as well as through conversations with former staff, residents, neighborhood association members, and others. Next. A major help throughout this research is the book Making the Mexican City by Delia Fernandez Jones. However, this book only covers the 1970s in education. Next. Some of the key points that I gathered are, in the 1960s, white flight increased Latino presence along Granville Avenue. Mexicans and Puerto Ricans became more visible in churches and businesses. In the late 1960s and early 70s, GRPS offered very limited bilingual education. Luis Morello pushed for district-wide bilingual programs. In the early 70s, the Latin American Council, LAC, became a major space for cultural and educational programs. LAC created the Neighborhood Education Center to support underserved Latino students. 69% of Latino high schoolers left GRPS before graduating. Major issues identified throughout this were there were few Latino teachers, no Latino counselors, and a lack of bilingual and bicultural curriculum. In 1971 to 73, LAC intervened with dropouts, created a cultural library, and secured $85,000 grant to create an alternative high school. The NEC expanded into additional school buildings. In the mid-1970s, GRPS still lacked bilingual education for all students and had no major increase in Latino teachers. In the late 1970s, LAC faced financial decline, leadership changes, and a diploma mill scandal. Funding dropped. The NEC was ordered to be turned over to GRPS, and the LAC dissolved by 1979. Next. Another pivotal part of the research is Cesar E. Chavez Elementary, which was formerly Hall Elementary. Next. Actually, you can go back on that one, sorry. In 2009, Cesar E. Chavez Elementary officially opened up the new and improved school that was formerly 1955 Hall Elementary. This was essentially called a bonus project. The majority of the school is a part of the Latino community. Today, Latino community makes up 80% of the school. After talking with many former staff and community members, I learned that Cesar E. Chavez Elementary would not have been rebuilt without the advocacy and determination of the parents and teachers. A 2004 bond was passed to redo many Grand Rapids schools. Cesar Chavez was not originally in it. This was considered a bonus project. A Grand Rapids school facilities worker met with a group of eager parents to discuss the needs of their school. They explained that the building was no longer large enough and it no longer reflected the demographics of the community. This former facilities worker, David Smith, was able to save enough money from the other rebuilds to fund the construction of an entirely new school. Former staff and community members have spoken very highly of him, noting that he played a tremendous role in making the rebuild possible. However, it is important to emphasize that former staff and community members consistently stated that without the persistent advocacy of the parents and school staff, the rebuild would not have happened. A former principal shared that no one would have come to the school to speak with the parents in the first place if he had not reached out. Throughout the rebuild, the construction company had roughly 20 to 25 parents and teachers come into bilingual meetings and discuss ideas for the new school. Unfortunately, a former Roosevelt Park neighborhood associate shared that the school was not very similar to what the parents had planned. Another former principal of the school stated that throughout this pivotal transition, the local community played a major role in support. Some of these places included the Roosevelt Neighborhood Association and the Hispanic Center. Next. Another huge issue that former staff and community members had mentioned was that they never wanted the name of the school to be changed in the first place because they felt like it did not represent the community. They wanted to keep the school named Hall Elementary. A former neighborhood associate said that the school did not match the community because Cesar Chavez was an activist for farmer families, not an inner city school. The school had encouraged parents to come to school board meetings, according to newspaper clipping and other individuals. After speaking with many people, many stated that they felt very disappointed after they were encouraged to share their opinions, not being listened to, even though it was the majority. The individual who was pushing for the name change eventually lost the following election by over 6,000 votes, as seen on the screen. Next. As we continue our research, we have found that there are few personal recollections of the Latino community represented in the community workshops and conversations we have held with former Union High School students within GRPS. This absence does not suggest that these personal recollections do not exist. Rather, they have not yet emerged through the individuals and sources we have engaged with so far. This is especially notable given that in 1982, Latino students made up approximately 10% of the student population at Grand Rapids Union High School. According to the Michigan Department of Education study, we will continue working to better understand the experiences of the Latino community, as many questions remain and there is still so much to learn. I will now hand it off to Joelle.
Thank you, Avery. What you shared reminds us that community voices have always been central in understanding the impact of school decisions. Before I share what I learned from these oral histories, I want to name my lens because I'm using a social work lens, and that's important for the audience to know. My data sources are the 2 oral history podcasts, and these interviews with Frederica Brown and Betsaida Valdivia, and I'm using their lived experiences as my primary data. So to begin, critical race theory helps me pay attention to how race and power shape what students experience inside of GRPS. Narrative theory supports this approach because lived stories are valid and powerful forms of knowledge. Person and environment reminds me that a student cannot be separated from their neighborhood, families, or the greater societal structures around them. And together, these 3 frameworks combine to help me understand that not only the historical events that took place, but also the people that are impacted by them. Next. When we look at redlining maps from the 1920s as pictured to the left, compared to the map from 2019 on the right, we can see that many of the same neighborhood boundaries remain. Frederica Brown's oral history helps illuminate how busing patterns established decades earlier were still shaping student experiences in the 1990s. Frederica grew up on the southeast side of Grand Rapids and attended Madison Elementary School, now Gerald R. Ford Academic Center. Despite living near several GRPS schools, she was later bused across the city to Westwood Middle School and then to Union High School, both located on the northwest side. She described regularly passing closer schools, including Central High School and Ottawa High School, without understanding why she was assigned so far away. In her experience, this movement across the city had become routine, even when families were not given clear explanations for these assignments. As Frederica explained in her oral history, we lived by Central in Ottawa, but we got on the bus, went over the bridge, got on the expressway, and went all the way to Westwood and Union. It was just what we did. As an adult parent navigating GRPS in the 2000s and 2010s, Frederica encountered new layers of the system, including school of choice, transfer option, bus hubs, and long transportation routes that still did not align with where families lived. She also described how parents often stayed within their own areas of the city and how crossing into other parts of Grand Rapids for school-related activities felt unfamiliar. Betsaida Valdivia's oral history shows how these long-standing geographic patterns were experienced differently by students in the 2010s. Rather than being shaped primarily by busing, her experience reflects how separation took form through school of choice and unequal school environments. As she moved from City High School to Innovation Central High School, she encountered differences in discipline practices, expectations, and level of trust students received from adults. Describing that transition, Betsaida shared, "When I switched over to Innovation Central, I remember my first hall sweep, just getting a note for detention. It was just a lot more punitive in my experience." Through a social work lens, these 2 oral histories together show how earlier busing decisions did not disappear over time, but instead, it evolved into more complex forms of separation. Geography structured schooling in the 1990s, while discipline, expectations, and institutional trust shaped student experiences in the 2010s. Next. Two key themes emerged across the oral histories of Frederica Brown and Betsaida Valdivia, spanning through the 1990s and the 2010s. The first theme is the connection between curriculum and identity. Both Frederica and Betsaida described moments of what they were taught did not reflect who they were, where they came from, or what their families valued. Curriculum often felt disconnected from students' lived realities and cultural backgrounds. Through a lens of social work, this matters because curriculum is not neutral. It shapes how students see themselves, whether they feel valued in the classroom, and whether learning feels relevant or distant. The second theme is differences in school experiences across GRPS. Betsaida's experience of attending both City High and Innovation Central highlights how expectations, discipline practices, and levels of trust can vary within the same district. These differences shaped how students interpreted their own potential and messages schools sent about who they believed in and invested in. Reflecting on this contrast, Betsaida explained that people went to City were treated with a lot of privilege in how they were treated, both by their school and to some extent by their district. Her words point to how unequal treatment was not only felt at the classroom or building, but also experienced in the broader district culture. Using a social work lens, this matters because school environments function as a form of support. They influence belonging, confidence, and future orientation. Depending on the environment students encounter each day, schools can either strengthen the opportunity or quietly limit it. To conclude, if you'd like to hear more about these stories and the voices of the people who lived them, I encourage you to listen to our podcast, GRPS Uncovered. The oral histories with Frederica Brown and Betsaida Valdivia offer depth, context, and emotion that quantitative data alone cannot capture. Thank you for taking the time to engage with these stories through a social work lens, and I will now hand things over to Leanne for our closing remarks.
Thank you, Joelle, and thank you, Avery and Melanie. Yeah, thank you so much for your perspectives and the work that you contributed to the study. So we're going to conclude now, and we'll return to the research questions that were introduced in the beginning. And what we can say is that these are emerging themes, and this is how we can comment on these questions so far. So after the closure of South High in '68, how did GRPS change or not change? And so I have 2 points about this. By the 1980s, certainly the district had come to be labeled as urban in the way many northern city school districts were. The shift was not accidental. It was the result of discriminatory housing patterns that took hold in the mid-20th century. As enrollment declined, the district's finances became increasingly strained. Many white families had left for other districts, and the student population became majority Black and Brown. With fewer resources, the district struggled to retain teachers, and the quality of education suffered. Decades of disinvestment in so-called inner-city neighborhoods created a challenging ecosystem, one in which schools were expected not just to educate students, but to overcome deep structural changes well beyond their walls. And the second point is what we also see during this period are significant changes in governance and decision-making, similar to patterns found in other urban school districts. Decision-making became increasingly top-down with less emphasis on community input. And it is within this context of diminished voice that community activism continued and in many cases intensified. In the 1990s, the district pursued reform through the specialization of schools, and over time, this evolved into today's themed schools and expanded school choice. These changes aligned with the broader market-based education reforms of the era and marked the gradual dissolution of the neighborhood school, fundamentally reshaping the district as a whole. So what were the effects of the district's integration efforts? Well, ironically, busing marked the beginning of increased separation and isolation, and very far from the original recommendations of the Racial Imbalance Committee, which actually envisioned cross-cultural exchange in schools as spaces to learn democratic pluralism. Busing did at least 2 significant things. First, it sparked white retaliation in ways that continue to shape our political discourse today. Many white families responded by leaving for suburban districts or enrolling their children in private and parochial schools, rejecting public schools as sites of social experimentation for the collective good. These debates exposed a persistent tension in education policy, individual liberty and parental choice versus the use of public schools to address broader social inequities. Over time, this contributed to the formation of increasingly distinct worlds, urban schools on one side and suburban and rural schools on the other. Second, busing accelerated the dissolution of the neighborhood school, an institution that had been central to the social fabric of Black families and communities. So why is GRPS still segregated in 2026? Again, in large part, it is because we think of the outcomes of busing and reform efforts in its aftermath. One workshop participant, a mom who currently has kids in the system, observed that what would follow after 68 was just, quote, segregation by another name, end quote. So for example, school specialization evolved into theme schools, charter schools, and expanded school choice policies. And while these reforms created opportunities for cross-district movement, in practice, most white students have concentrated in the most selective themed schools, such as City High. And this pattern reflects a broader history of public education reform over the past several decades. One in which reforms have too often reinforced and reproduced segregation and existing social hierarchies rather than disrupting them. Next. If you would like more information about this presentation or project, please contact kangl@gvsu.edu. This concludes our presentation. We thank the GR Historical Commission for inviting us to this year's History Detectives program. Thank you.